So Pragya, just go straight into it.
Thank you, Sanjoy, and welcome, Lakshmi. Sanjay's already done a fine job of giving you an introduction about the session that we're just about to have. Uh, but I think I'd want to start by asking you all a question. Thank you for being here, but why do you think it is so important for us to be talking about women in work? Well, for one, if you care about the economy, and you really should if you live particularly in India at this point in time, you'd be happy to know that if we could put women to work, our GDP would rise and rise and rise, and we will meet the growth rates that we've been aspiring for forever, making India into a trillion, X trillion economy, whatever its aspiration and ambition has been for the longest time. But even more so, there are social dividends, like Sanjoy said, that are key. Women, if they are working, if they are financially independent, and they are able to stand up for themselves, they're able to protect themselves and the future generations, they're able to educate themselves. And the social dividends are endless. Now, you would imagine that given how important it is for women to be working, we should have more and more women in the workforce. However, that is not the case. 19.6 million women have dropped out of the workforce in India since 2005. And bear in mind, 2005 onwards, we are talking about India's high growth years, when jobs were growing, when the GDP was growing, when India was truly shining. Women were dropping off the workforce, and that process hasn't stalled. Unfortunately, women are increasingly dropping off the workforce. Now, there are very, very complex reasons behind it, but it is important to bear in mind that we cannot discuss those reasons in silos. In fact, we cannot talk about women and work in silo. Women in work is inextricably related to all the other struggles that women face. And therefore, it is a much more complex topic than you could imagine. And we have just about 35 minutes to unpack it. So I want to get right to it. And Lakshmi, I would want to start by asking you, since we are also marking the 10th anniversary of the Charter of UN Women, and you've been such an important part of it, particularly in its formative years, could you start by telling us a little bit about the projects that you have undertaken or you've been a part of in your work in this arena, particularly ones that mean a lot to you?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be part of this series, the Brave New World series, and it's timely to take up issues of gender equality and women's empowerment. As you rightly said, women's right to work, women's work, and women in the workplace. These are issues that are part of the larger ecosystem that and the larger culture of gender equality and women's empowerment that needs to be fostered. And it's not only for women themselves and for their benefit, but as you said, there are huge economic, social, and national dividends that any country derives. So let me get back to your question, the projects that I was involved in. Whilst I was involved very much with UN Women's advocacy work, movement building work, we have the He for She, Planet 50/50 champion, Step It Up for Gender Equality, all these huge global campaigns, which were very successful. But also I was involved in the Knowledge Hub, data revolution part of it. And I was also very much, most of all, involved in partnership building with governments, with civil society and private sector. But all of this to also emphasize and build on the work of global norms and standard setting on gender equality and women's empowerment itself. The Bill of Rights of Women being strengthened and reinforced and prioritized in every area, and particularly in the areas of eliminating violence against women, increasing their voice participation and leadership in all sectors, in all areas of decision making, in women, peace and security area, and also all the areas that are related to economic empowerment. And the world of work is about economic empowerment.
Sorry, may I interrupt you for a second, Lakshmi? You mentioned norm building and standard setting in all of these areas, which are interlinked and supremely important. Could you tell us a little bit about what you mean by norm building and standard setting, and why is it so important?
I've always been inspired. I've had feminist parents, and I've all grown up with Simone de Beauvoir and Gloria Steinem, and of course admired all our own heroes from the women's movement. And I've grown up with the idea that Simone put forward, which is that one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman, and all the discrimination that flows from the surrounding, the environment around you. So norms is about changing that and making sure that you are treated as a human being equal to a man. And that's what norms are about. So when we make norms at the international level, we are getting member states, governments, and we have done that at the highest levels. We have had the first ever global summit where we had 72 heads of state and government come and commit to gender equality and women's empowerment related commitments. So that's what is important, that there is a political buy-in to change laws, policies, measures, take measures and implement those laws. So that's the driving that we did from UN Women. The other aspect is changing social norms. And there are many things that, are so difficult to change: culture, harmful practices, religion, weighing in on the traditional fault lines, as was mentioned, of gender inequality. So even for that, if you can change government's perception of those norms and become partners with government in addressing these and unpacking those structural barriers and taking down those structural barriers, those normative social norms, the harmful social norms and traditional practices often, then you make a big difference in bringing about a level playing field for women and men, and boys and girls.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And thank you for doing that work, because until we have norms, we have nothing to hold governments and societies accountable for.
Yeah.
But one of these sort of norm-setting exercises that has, threads the entire world together is the Sustainable Development Goals. If you could give us a quick introduction of what the Sustainable Development Goals are, how do women's rights fit into them, and where we are in the journey of women within Sustainable Development Goals.
So Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development is an agenda for 21st century agenda for progress of humankind economically, socially, and environmentally, and in an integrated way. Because before that, it was disjointed and it was not sustainable development. And it has 17 goals ranging from ending poverty, health for all, education for all, peace, and there is a whole 17 goals. But we made sure, and I think that's something that I count as UN Women and my own personal achievement, is to secure a dedicated, comprehensive SDG 5, and we always say high five, SDG 5 with 9 targets, which the international community has adopted now as its goal, that it must be reached by 2030, right? Of course, these goals and targets, they bring together existing norms and standards, but these are now in the form of goals and targets. And we also have in 11 other SDGs, we have gender sensitive targets. So it's, mainstream throughout the Agenda 21. So there is a clear recognition that for achieving sustainable development, gender equality, and the empowering of all women and girls, that's what the goal says, is critical. And what does the goal talk about? The 9 targets, I don't want to go through the whole goal, but I think it's important, particularly in the context of work that we are going to talk about. It's important to say that there is a very strong emphasis on economic empowerment, which means access to resources, economic resources. Secondly, which is also the key to economic independence and autonomy, right? And that is the essence of gender equality and women's empowerment. The other aspect which it addresses, a related aspect, is access to financial resources, access, ownership, and control. This is the exact word. This is the exact wording. Access, ownership, and control over land, natural resources, financial services, all of that. So without this, there is no equality and independence and autonomy. So this is one major thing. Of course, ending violence against women becomes a global target, and it is an integral part of sustainable development, thanks to this goal. And all the harmful practices, all the other things like child marriage, all this now becomes a target that the world has adopted. The other aspect, a new breakthrough concept, and which was very difficult to get through because a lot of men were negotiating. So the concept of unpaid care work, recognizing, valorizing unpaid care work of women, and then burden sharing in the family, in the home, but also provisioning of care services. So that whole concept and the birth of the concept of the care economy, and how the burden should not fall on women, and in fact it should be seen as a basis for creating an organized care economy which would generate quality jobs for both. And we had calculated in UN Women that it would generate 1 billion jobs for both men and women, if we were to organize the care economy. And you can imagine how women-centric the care economy is, and how empowering it can be. So these are some of the ideas, but of course there is enabling technologies. There is the whole issue of voice participation and leadership in public life, economic life, and in decision making. And there is the very important other issue of sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. So this whole goal is therefore a very empowering tool that governments can use to transform social norms. I'm coming back to norms here. And also to drive their own policies, legislation, strategies. And it calls upon governments to change laws, policies, to achieve these targets.
So we will come back to every single thing that you mentioned is in fact closely linked with the issue of women going back to workplaces, being able to work and carrying on in work, which is also very, very important. But before we kind of dive any deeper into it, I want to stop for a second and unpack the very term that we are discussing here, which is women at work. What is it that we talk about conceptually when we talk about women in workplaces and women's work?
Right. I think the basis of feminism, if you I know that you are yourself a feminist as well, is the fact that for centuries, men have sought to control our bodies and our labor. So now, if you look at it from that perspective, women's labor has been seen as something that flows from her reproductive role. Biologically, because she gives birth, her reproductive role is used to keep her, to say women's places in the home. So her labor is focused, her work is not even recognized as work, because we heard, even during the debates on unpaid care work, we heard, why do you want to call it unpaid? They do it out of labor of love. It's their love, it's their duty to the family. So, that's the concept of women's work or not work that has come up over the ages. The second aspect that has come up, so this unpaid care work of women is at home. And care work involves care of the elderly, care of children, and also domestic work. So this is one aspect. And as Kamla Bhasin rightly points out, on the other side, this imposes a code of Pitrusatta burden, right, on men, that they have to go out there into the world of work and be the breadwinner. So that concept has evolved over time, thankfully. And in India's case, I think the freedom movement was a very big trigger for women to come out, just as in Europe and in the US, the great wars, brought women out into the factories and into the fields. So it became a more engendered workplace. So that's how this has evolved. Now, unfortunately, even though over the decades, more and more women have come into the workplace, it is still a man's world. And we are going to, I hope, discuss what are those challenges that women face. You already referred to the drop in participation, but I don't know whether you want me to go through it now or a little later.
No, I mean, I want to just sort of come back to it in my question, and this is a great lead into it. As I was saying earlier, so far we've been talking about the world at large, developing countries at large, but for coming back to our immediate context, which is India, like I mentioned before, that there is this mystery of women disappearing from the workforce, even as our economy grew, even as we managed to increase enrollment of women in schools, and more women even embraced higher education. Even so, we see this sort of steep fall of women from the workforce. 19.6 million is a massive figure, and this is recorded until 2011. After that, the fall continues, right? Now, maybe some of the women who one could argue that who went off to work earlier are now embracing higher education, so they are in schools, in the colleges instead of being at work, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, when we look at statistics, it's not just younger women who are not in the workforce. Even older women are dropping out of the workforce. Now, there can be many myriad complex reasons behind it, but a lot of data and a lot of research that has been done by academics, talks about, points to that one sort of very singular, persistent reason which you brought up couple of times already that the burden of caregiving, the burden of domestic work is squarely on women's shoulders. And up until the fact that we can get men to participate in that, we are not going to be able to liberate them. There could, of course, be several other reasons. There could be safety, there could be lack of appropriate jobs, discrimination in the workplace. So I would want to get your thoughts, experientially, and of course in what you've seen in your work, as to why do you think this is happening? Why are we losing women in the workforce?
So there are three things that we have to look at. What is the structure of the labor market in India as far as women are concerned? The second aspect is what are the demand side issues, where women's labor force is coming out from, okay? And what are the supply side issues, the employer's side, okay? So the first issue of the structure of the labor market as far as women is concerned is that only, as you said, there has been a drop from 2006 to now. There has been a 10% point drop in women's participation in the formal workforce, and which means that 75% of women are in the informal workforce. What does that mean? That it is temporary, precarious, without social protection, it is low paid, low skilled, so all of those aspects make it very volatile, and also, as you see, not a level playing field at all for women. And of course, the related entrepreneurship aspect is very important. We discussed it before when you and I were chatting, that, they are micro entrepreneurs, street vendors, hawkers, So again, the precarity of their work comes into play. So that's one side of this whole structural issue. The other side is in the formal sector, we have to have a value chain of education, skills, training, and retraining. That is absolutely necessary, and an investment in girls' education. And I would begin even with this whole change in the culture of girl aversion and boy preference. So people tend to invest more in boys' education and less in a girl's education. So that has to be changed. But also, and that's why this Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao campaign is very, very important in bringing out, and also schemes that support that is very important. Both nutrition is another very major aspect, health and nutrition. And then the other aspect is, of course, how many, you mentioned that more women are getting educated, but I was looking at some statistics. Only 25% of women are getting higher education. So even the pool of those who are entering the formal workforce is a small pool. So in a way, if you see, it's proportionate to the representation in the formal workforce. So that is one part of that value chain, the education, skills, and training. Then there is, of course, this whole attitudinal thing on the demand side, as you you don't need to work. There was a time when I remember when we had joined the labor force, and there were many women who were joining banks, who were joining white collar jobs in order to have that second income. But somehow now people feel they can do that through flexi work or jobs in the gig economy or remote working. So that statistics also we have to take into account when we say there is a drop. Okay. The other aspect is domestic violence that takes away women from the workforce. As much as, there are deterrent factors in the workforce itself, we have statistics to say that domestic violence creates psychological conditions which make people drop out of the workforce and become inoperational in the workforce. So these are the factors on the demand side. On the supply side, there are many issues. Of course, the conscious and unconscious bias in organizations. One feminist said very famously that the structural organization of work is more inflexible than women's ovaries. So, that's what it is. It's such a male-oriented structure that the needs, the interests, the aptitudes, the talent of women is not accommodated automatically. So that's something that needs to be changed. And so conscious, unconscious bias, the fact that, the women have to pay what is called the motherhood penalty. You referred to that. Women take time off for pregnancies, maternity leave, or for when the children, they drop out of the workforce and then find it difficult to get back. So this whole pipeline of hiring or entry, retention, promotion and re-entry, and also retraining, all of that pipeline has to be complete. And it often breaks, it often leaks. We call it the leaking pipeline. So that's also something that deters women and makes them either drop off on their own or they are just dropped off. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And then, of course, there are issues of sexual harassment at the workplace and other issues that also could have. And also no care services on site. This is a very major thing that we have been advocating, that, enlightened employers should provide for care services on site, for childcare services, because that's a very big plus to encourage women to come to work.
So that was a comprehensive diagnosis, and you also touched upon some solutions here. I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate, because solutions have to come simultaneously from the society as well as from policy, from government. So I was wondering if you'd like to kind of just touch upon some of the solutions that we need urgently, some of the changes that we can make that would take us in the right direction.
Well, I think we have to make all the schemes that the government has for Skill India, Digital India, MSME support, Atmanirbhar Bharat, all the key areas to address both grassroots women and their issues, and also, middle class women who need support. So I think that really needs to be both transversal, but these transversal schemes need to be targeted towards women and supporting women and fostering their skills, their capacities, and so that we strengthen the demand side on one side. The other side is, I think there is some need for changing the ecosystem. I think public service, by the way, is already quite gender equal in terms of the intake. Maybe leadership is something that we really need to work on. That, women, it's one of the more women intensive areas, government service. So that's one. But I think private sector, we need to incentivize, disincentivize from doing certain things. And also, sometimes we may need to make it mandatory for companies to act in a gender responsive actors or stakeholders in this whole gender equality project.
So perhaps make it, think about an equality law that has sort of
Absolutely
on the private sector to sort of honor the promise of equality that's enshrined in our constitution. And you mentioned leadership. I mean, I've just been told that I have just possibly time for one last question. So I'm going to, and I have lots of questions. So the one I'm going to really pick from there is leadership. You mentioned that the sort of private sector, particularly, when we talk about bureaucrats, we talk about the civil service, we still have representation of women. And because, of course, it's the state, they have recourse to, if they are, aggrieved, then they have recourses that they can take. However, like you mentioned earlier, so many of our policies, they are well-intentioned policies, they are good policies, but they somehow tend to be blind towards what women need from those policies, whether it's skilling, whether it's digital. And this has been the problem through governments, etc., etc. And perhaps it can be traced to the fact that we don't have enough women policy makers. What is your opinion of women leadership in the political and governance arena, and how we can increase that?
Well, I think we have shown that by having a special temporary, it was meant to be temporary, but it's become permanent, and it's good. By taking these special measures and imposing quotas at the local government level, we have transformed the landscape of local governance and women's participation, voice participation and leadership at the local level, panchayat and Zilla Parishad level. Of course, we need to do more in order to empower those governors, the women who are now part of this. And that's what at one time we were very much working with the government to train these women to be governance leaders. So that is one part. But I think what is important now is to move to the state assembly and the parliament level, and because this parliament that was elected in 2019 had the highest number of women ever, and percentage 14%, but which is way below the global average of 25%, and certainly way below the critical mass of 33%, and way below the parity that we seek. And I do believe that one woman can represent all women better than all men can represent one woman. So in that sense, if we are a democracy, and democratic governance and policy making, as you said, is absolutely a must, then we must move on with the Women's Reservation Bill being passed, which has been pending since 1996. But the good thing is that I see that it is very much in the Sankalp Patra of the BJP. It was there in 2014, but it's also very much there in the 2019 one. So I'm very hopeful that we will have that Sankalp being realized and being carried forward.
Yes, I hope so too. And for those of you who are listening, I hope you will back this. I hope you will, successive governments have come and gone, but I hope you will demand this of your government. If you have any manner of doubt, think about this. If Lakshmi was not a part of leadership, perhaps the global SDG goals would still be blind to women's needs and women's struggles. So that's what one woman can achieve. That's what teams of women can achieve. And therefore, it's really, really important for us to talk about women in leadership with that. I am going to see if we have questions from the audience. Yes, we do. And I am going to put them to you. Okay, so the first question is from Rachita Akhilesh Chauhan, who asks, with childcare being expensive and now a scary proposition in COVID times, do you see women losing the choice of wanting to work, especially in middle-class Indian society? This is a very important question.
Yeah.
And I sort of increase its ambit to say that the pandemic forces there's a wonderful paper and sort of unfortunate paper that published by Ashwini Deshpande at the Ashoka that talks about how the bulk of unemployment has gone to women to sort of women are facing it much more than men. So yes, Rachita's question also is very pertinent to that.
Absolutely. When we talk about COVID-19, we have been talking about the new normal, isn't it? And what is the new normal that's going to come out of this? And for ages, feminists have been talking about the new normal of gender equality and women's empowerment. So my point is, we do need, when we are reinventing the world, economic, social, political, and governance, and the way we do business, work, leisure, pray, everything is changing. We need to also do it in a gender responsive way, and addressing just these kind of problems, including this whole issue of childcare. And that's why, I really want to emphasize the idea of the care economy. How we make it more sustainable. It will also provide jobs to women, but not the precarious jobs that our domestic workers who work as nannies or others have. But those jobs will be empowering jobs with dignity and decent work, as we call it. So I think that is one thing that should come out of this, that we value the support that we get from domestic workers, and how do we make it more sustainable for them, even through, and make it shock proof. I think this is what it showed, that when you had a shock, they couldn't access the sites of work, right? So that's one. The other thing is this whole concept of creating an infrastructure of childcare, which is lacking. I think we have been too dependent on individual, nannies at home, because you've asked about middle class. I think for all sections of society, we need to have childcare centers, creches that provide quality and supervised care for children, so that women are able to, they're productively, they get engaged in work, in the world of work.
We have a question from Sachdev Ramakrishna, who says that we are seeing winds of change through increased representation of women in India's parliament, countries electing women as prime ministers, or NASA honoring Katherine Johnson for her contribution to the space mission. Now, I want your opinion on this. Personally, I find this sort of exceptionalism a little bit troubling, because there's this tokenism that we kind of take recourse to. I don't know where you're getting your data about women's increased participation in the parliament. That's something Lakshmi has already spoken to. We don't nearly have enough women in Indian parliament or legislative assemblies. Electing as prime ministers, it's been happening since times immemorial. We've had Indira Gandhi, we've had Sheikh Hasina, we've had Benazir Bhutto. That doesn't change, things systematically. And of course, then this honoring of like a Katherine Johnson, or, I mean, I would change this question to, I mean, do you feel things are really changing, that these are indicators of change? And secondly, do you think that this sort of exceptionalism, tokenism actually takes away from the systemic issues we really urgently need to address?
Well, I would say that it's important to have role models of success. And one of the things I didn't mention earlier that holds women back on the supply side are glass walls and glass ceilings and sticky floors. Okay. So if we have examples of women who have broken that glass ceiling, or occupationally they are serving in the army, and now, PM Modi has opened that up as well to women. That is something to be celebrated, supported, fostered. But I agree with you, we don't declare victory and one swallow doesn't make a summer. We have to have a systemic change and an ecosystem change, and it must show itself on the ground in terms of numbers. After all, we are half of humanity. So we must at least approximate, something that is closer to that 50% that we represent. So I agree with both of you.
Excellent answer.
Need for celebrate, and more stories to spread those stories to inspire people. So it works both ways.
Excellent answer. Final question. Does the structure, this is from Neha Dasgupta, who's asking, does the structure of workforce need to change too? While there's medical leave for something like a fever, cramps during periods have to be taken into stride as well. How does one change that? I think you spoke about this.
I spoke about it, yes.
Maybe what I will also take as part of this question is something else that Ria has asked, which is
right.
The impact of the physical and mental health toll that women, if they're working outside and they have responsibilities in the home, they don't get any time off, what kind of a toll does that take on the health? So both these questions combined, your thoughts?
See, one of the things that I should have mentioned in the concept of work and women in the workplace is this whole concept of time poverty. In fact, what has happened as women have joined the workforce, and even I would call even the informal work as work. And then they have had to combine that even then with domestic work, because they are doing, in India, for example, they are doing 3 times the amount of care and housework that men are doing. Okay. So you can imagine, and in rural areas, it's even greater, that work burden. So, and time poverty. So it is, whilst, yes, you are going out, you're getting the opportunity of being in the labor force, you are also being paradoxically, you are suffering from greater and greater time poverty. And the consequences, health consequences of that, these are enormous. And, this, again, the concept that was self-sacrificing, she doesn't even talk about her health issues, so that kind of image has been perpetuated. But again, I think we have to break out of this, recognize the time poverty of women of all classes and ages, and find solutions that are both at the home front, burden sharing by other members of the family, particularly the men, and also, being more considerate and supportive in terms of the conditions of work. That's what the concept of decent work is, that conditions of work are also sensitive, gender sensitive, as you gave examples of.
On that note, we will have to conclude this session. Thank you so much, all of you, for listening to us, and thank you. It's been a real pleasure listening to you, Lakshmi. I mean that, and learning from you. And I hope to get to do this more in person as COVID subsides. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
It was a pleasure myself to be part of this and to meet you and interact with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi, Puri, Pragya, Tiwari. What better way to mark the 10th anniversary of the signing of the UN Women Charter? Lakshmi, Puri, just one question. In the UN Charter, is there a sense that in governments there should be much more representation of women, be it elected or otherwise? And is there any kind of sign up for that in the SDGs? Or is it only implied that it would be a good thing to have?
No, it is one of the targets, that equality, or equal representation, or equal participation and leadership in public life and in economic sectors. So this is one of the targets, very much there in the SDG 5.
Well, we hope that we get there at some point of time. Thank you both so much, and thank you all for watching. We're sorry that we couldn't take, as usual, all the questions pouring in. I know that there were so many, or perhaps we can post them to Lakshmi and Pragya separately. Thank our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. Please do remember to log in tomorrow, the 4th of July, for another set of great sessions. We begin with The Absence of Justice, John Ralston Saul, in conversation with Manjushri Thapa. The asymmetrical power structures across cultures and continents have only been further reinforced in the times of the pandemic as individuals and societal conflicts deepen by the day. In conversation with Manjushri Thapa, political philosopher and public intellectual, John Ralston Saul speaks of the need to address these imbalances. And this will be at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The second session on Saturday, the 4th of July, will be A.K. Ramanujan's A Poet's Diary. Krishna Ramanujan and Guillermo Rodriguez in conversation. The legendary poet, folklorist, translator, and scholar A.K. Ramanujan left an indelible mark on the understanding and appreciation of Indian literature around the world. After his premature death in 1993, Ramanujan's personal journals, diaries, and notes, referred to as the AKR papers, remained with the University of Chicago until his son, Krishna Ramanujan, and Guillermo Rodriguez edited them. Published as Journeys, A Poet's Diary, they take us to the heart of the poet's, scholar's vision and work. And this will be at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you all, and see you tomorrow. Stay safe.